The moment my sister Delilah walked into our family dining room last Thanksgiving, I knew something was different. She had that smug smile plastered across her face as she approached my usual seat at the head of the table. When my parents casually told me to move without explanation, I simply stood up and walked away. I did not argue because I had finally seen the truth about my family. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this incredible family drama story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story of family betrayal and ultimate revenge sounds intriguing, please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories. Trust me, what happens next will completely blow your mind and change everything you think you know about family loyalty. My name is Serafina Blackwell, and I am 28 years old. Until that Thanksgiving dinner, I believed I was the favored daughter in our wealthy Massachusetts family. My father, Richard Blackwell, owned a successful investment firm, and my mother, Patricia, managed our family foundation. For years, I had worked as the chief financial officer at my father's company, believing I was being groomed to take over the family business. The dinner seat incident was not just about furniture placement. It was a deliberate signal that my position in the family hierarchy had shifted dramatically. Delilah, my 25-year-old sister, had always been the rebellious one. She dropped out of college, traveled the world on our parents' dime, and never held a steady job. Yet somehow, she was now sitting in the seat that had been mine since childhood. During dinner, I listened carefully to the conversation. Delilah spoke confidently about business matters she had never shown interest in before. She mentioned meetings with clients I had never heard of, and discussed financial strategies that sounded suspiciously familiar. My parents nodded approvingly at everything she said, while completely ignoring my attempts to contribute to the conversation. After dinner, I decided to investigate. I had access to all the company files, and something in my gut told me to look deeper. What I discovered in those late-night hours of digging through financial records would haunt me forever. There were transactions I had never authorized, client accounts I had never seen, and most shocking of all, my electronic signature had been forged on dozens of documents. The fraudulent transactions totaled over $2 million. Money had been systematically diverted from client accounts into a shell company that I traced back to Delilah. But the forgeries of my signature meant that legally, I would be held responsible for the embezzlement. My own family had set me up to take the fall for their crimes. The pattern became clear as I dug deeper. For months, Delilah had been learning the business not to help the company, but to replace me in the fraud scheme. My parents had been grooming her to be their new accomplice, while setting me up as the scapegoat. Every family dinner, every casual conversation about work, every piece of advice I had given them had been used against me. I found emails between my parents and Delilah discussing how to handle the Serafina problem. They referred to me as a liability who had gotten too close to discovering their illegal activities. The plan was elegant in its cruelty: frame me, for the embezzlement, have me arrested and discredited, then continue their scheme with Delilah as the new face of legitimacy. The contempt in their written communications was devastating. My mother wrote about how I had always been too honest for our kind of business. My father complained that I asked too many questions and suggested they needed someone more flexible with ethics. Delilah eagerly volunteered to be that person, seeing it as her opportunity to finally surpass her older sister. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their arrogance, they had underestimated my intelligence and my access to information. As the chief financial officer, I had backup access to systems they did not know about, and I had been creating my own records of all transactions as a matter of professional habit. The realization that my entire family viewed me as expendable was crushing. These were the people who had raised me, who had celebrated my achievements, and who had claimed to love me unconditionally. Yet they were willing to destroy my life and send me to prison to protect their illegal fortune. I spent 3 sleepless nights documenting everything, I made copies of all the evidence, stored them in multiple secure locations, and began formulating a plan. If my family wanted to play games of deception and betrayal, I would show them what a real strategic mind could accomplish. The dinner seat had been a power play, but it had also been their fatal mistake. By showing their hand so obviously, they had given me the motivation and the timeline I needed to act. I was no longer the naive daughter who trusted her family implicitly. I was now a woman who understood that blood relationships meant nothing when money and greed were involved. As I sat in my home office, surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and shock were transforming into something much more dangerous, a cold, calculated determination to expose the truth and ensure that justice was served. They had chosen Delilah over me, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. The following Monday morning, I walked into Blackwell Investments with a briefcase full of evidence and a heart full of steel. I had spent the weekend not just gathering proof of their crimes, but also researching exactly how to expose them in the most devastating way possible. My family thought they were dealing with the same trusting daughter they had always manipulated, but they were about to discover a completely different person. My first stop was not my father's office, but the conference room where our biggest clients were scheduled for their quarterly review meeting. The Pemberton Family Trust, worth $47 million, was among the accounts that had been systematically plundered. I had spent Sunday night preparing a presentation that would lay out exactly how their money had been stolen. When my father saw me setting up the projector in the conference room, his face went pale. "Serafina, what are you doing? This is not your meeting anymore." His voice carried a nervous edge that I had never heard before. Actually, Richard, as the chief financial officer who discovered massive fraud in our client accounts, this is exactly my meeting. I had stopped calling him Dad the moment I read his emails about destroying my life. Unless you would prefer to explain to the Pembertons personally how $2 million of their money ended up in an offshore account controlled by your other daughter. The color drained completely from his face. Behind him, I could see Delilah approaching with my mother, both of them dressed for what they thought would be a routine client meeting. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. When the Pemberton family arrived, I was ready. I presented a detailed breakdown of every fraudulent transaction, complete with digital forensics showing how my signature had been forged and how the money had been moved through various shell companies before landing in accounts controlled by Delilah. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Margaret Pemberton, the family matriarch, listened in stunned silence as I explained how her late husband's money had been systematically stolen by the very people she had trusted to protect it. "Are you telling me that Richard and Patricia Blackwell have been embezzling from our family for over 2 years? That is exactly what I am telling you, Mrs. Pemberton, and I have documentation proving that they forged my signature to make it appear as though I was the one authorizing these illegal transfers." I handed her a folder containing copies of all the evidence. "I am formally reporting this fraud to you as the primary account holder, and I will be filing criminal charges this afternoon." The explosion that followed was spectacular. Delilah screamed that I was lying, that I was jealous of her new position in the company. My mother accused me of betraying my own family for money. My father tried to convince the Pembertons that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved privately. But the evidence spoke louder than their denials. Bank records, email communications, digital forensics analysis, and timeline documentation painted a clear picture of premeditated fraud and conspiracy. Margaret Pemberton immediately called her attorney, who arrived within 30 minutes and began documenting everything for criminal prosecution. The scene in that conference room was unlike anything I had ever experienced. My father, who had always been the commanding presence in any business situation, was reduced to stammering excuses that convinced no one. My mother kept looking around desperately as if searching for an escape route. Delilah alternated between fury and panic, realizing that her dreams of easy money were crumbling around her. But the most satisfying moment came when Margaret Pemberton looked directly at my parents and said, "In 60 years of business, I have never encountered such breathtaking arrogance and stupidity. You stole from a family that could afford the best forensic accountants and criminal attorneys in the country. Did you really think we would never notice?" I watched my family's faces as the reality of their situation sank in. They had chosen greed over integrity, and they had chosen Delilah over me, but they had never stopped to consider the consequences of their actions. They had assumed that family loyalty would protect them from accountability, but they had destroyed that loyalty themselves. The Pemberton attorney informed my parents that criminal charges would be filed by the end of the week. He also mentioned that other clients would need to be contacted immediately to determine the full scope of the fraud. The investigation would be thorough, public, and devastating to their reputations. As the meeting concluded, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was my family despite everything they had done, and watching them face the consequences of their choices was not entirely pleasant. But justice demanded that their crimes be exposed, and I was no longer willing to be their victim. My father made one last desperate attempt to appeal to family sentiment. "Serafina, please, we can work this out privately. Do you really want to destroy your own family?" I looked at him with the cold clarity that comes from complete betrayal. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided to frame me for your crimes. I am not your daughter anymore. I am the witness who is going to make sure you face justice for what you have done." Delilah lunged at me, then screaming about how I had ruined everything. Security had to escort her from the building as she continued to shriek threats and accusations. My mother followed her out, weeping dramatically and claiming that I had broken her heart. But I felt no sympathy for their pain. They had been willing to send me to prison to protect themselves. They had chosen money over family and greed over love. The consequences they were facing now were entirely of their own making. As I packed my personal belongings from my office, I realized that this was only the beginning. Exposing their fraud to the Pembertons had been the first move in what would become a much larger battle. I had evidence of other crimes, other victims, and other betrayals that would need to be brought to light. The news of the Blackwell investment fraud spread through our social circle like wildfire. By Tuesday morning, my phone was ringing constantly, with calls from other clients, family friends, and even reporters who had caught wind of the scandal. But the most important calls came from people I had never expected to become my allies in this fight for justice. The first unexpected ally was Marcus Webb, a forensic accountant who had worked with our firm on several major cases. He called me Tuesday afternoon with information that would change everything. "Serafina, I have been investigating some irregularities in your family's accounts for the past 6 months. Your public exposure of the Pemberton fraud has given me the legal cover I need to share what I have discovered." Marcus revealed that the fraud was much more extensive than even I had realized. It was not just client money that had been stolen. My parents had also been embezzling from the family foundation, diverting funds meant for charitable causes into their personal accounts. The total amount of stolen money was approaching $8 million. Even more shocking was his discovery that I was not the only family member being set up as a scapegoat. My cousin Daniel, who worked as the foundation's director, was also being framed for the charity embezzlement. Marcus had documentation showing that Daniel's signature had been forged on foundation checks just as mine had been forged on the investment documents. "Your parents are not just criminals, Serafina. They are criminal masterminds who have been planning this operation for years. They have been systematically positioning family members to take the fall for their crimes while they escape with the money." This revelation led me to reach out to Daniel, who had been increasingly stressed and confused about discrepancies in the foundation accounts. When I shared the evidence with him, his relief was palpable. "I thought I was losing my mind," he confessed. "The numbers never added up, but every time I questioned something, Aunt Patricia would make me feel like I was incompetent." Daniel became my second crucial ally. As foundation director, he had access to financial records and donor information that complemented my knowledge of the investment side of the business. Together, we began mapping out the full scope of our parents' criminal enterprise. Our investigation revealed a sophisticated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transactions that had been operating for over 3 years. My parents had not just been stealing money. They had been laundering it through fake charitable donations and fictitious investment opportunities. But the most devastating discovery came when we found evidence that my parents had been blackmailing other family members to maintain their silence. My Uncle James had discovered some of the fraud 2 years earlier, but he had been threatened with financial ruin if he reported it. They had leveraged his gambling debts to keep him quiet. This led us to our third major ally, Uncle James himself. When Daniel and I approached him with our evidence, he broke down completely. "I have been living in terror for 2 years," he admitted. "I knew what they were doing was wrong, but they convinced me that reporting them would destroy the entire family." James brought crucial insider knowledge about how the blackmail and intimidation systems worked. He also had recordings of conversations where my parents explicitly discussed their criminal activities and their plans to frame other family members. These recordings would prove to be the smoking gun that sealed their fate. As our alliance grew stronger, we began to understand that we were not just fighting for justice. We were fighting for the survival of our entire extended family. My parents had been systematically destroying the lives and reputations of anyone who might threaten their criminal enterprise. The emotional toll of these discoveries was enormous. This was not just financial crime. This was systematic betrayal of the deepest family bonds. My parents had weaponized love and loyalty to commit their crimes and cover their tracks. But our alliance was giving us strength we could never have had individually. Marcus provided the technical expertise to trace the money and document the crimes. Daniel provided access to foundation records and donor information. James provided insider knowledge and recorded evidence. Together, we were building a case that would be impossible to defend against. We also began reaching out to other victims. Mrs. Elizabeth Warren, an elderly widow who had donated $300,000 to our family foundation, was devastated to learn that her late husband's memorial fund had been stolen. She immediately hired her own attorney and joined our growing coalition seeking justice. The Pemberton family, meanwhile, had conducted their own investigation and discovered additional fraud in their accounts going back 5 years. They brought resources and connections that gave our alliance serious legal firepower. By Thursday of that week, our informal alliance had become a formal coalition with professional legal representation. We had attorneys, forensic accountants, private investigators, and victim advocates all working together to ensure that justice would be served. The turning point came when we received a call from Rebecca Martinez, an FBI financial crimes investigator who had been monitoring our local news coverage of the fraud. "We have been investigating a network of investment fraud and charity scams in this region," she informed us. "Your evidence connects to a much larger criminal conspiracy that we have been tracking for over a year." The FBI involvement transformed our family drama into a federal criminal investigation. Suddenly, we were not just seeking justice for ourselves. We were helping to expose a criminal network that had victimized dozens of families across multiple states. But with this escalation came new dangers. My parents were no longer just family members trying to cover up their crimes. They were now cornered criminals facing federal charges, and cornered criminals can become extremely dangerous. The FBI warned us that we might face intimidation, harassment, or even threats of violence as the investigation progressed. They provided us with security protocols and emergency contact numbers, treating us as witnesses in a major federal case. As I reflected on how far this situation had escalated, I felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. We had successfully exposed the truth and built a powerful alliance seeking justice. But the real battle was just beginning, and I had no idea what desperate measures my parents might take to escape the consequences of their crimes. The dinner seat incident that had started this journey seemed almost quaint compared to the federal criminal conspiracy we had uncovered. My family had betrayed not just me, but dozens of innocent people who had trusted them with their life savings and charitable donations. Justice was coming, but I was beginning to understand that the price of that justice might be higher than any of us had anticipated. Just when I thought our coalition was unbreakable, the worst possible thing happened. It was Monday morning, 2 weeks after the FB. I had officially opened their investigation when I received a panicked call from Marcus Webb. His voice was shaking as he delivered news that would shatter everything we had built. "Serafina, we have a serious problem. Someone has been feeding information to your parents about our investigation. They knew about the FBI meeting before it happened. They knew about Mrs. Warren joining our coalition. They even knew about the recorded conversations James provided." My blood ran cold. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I am saying we have a traitor in our group. Someone has been working with your parents from the beginning, and they just played their hand. Your cousin Daniel has disappeared, and he took copies of all our evidence with him." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Daniel, who I had trusted completely, who had seemed so relieved to learn the truth, who had worked tirelessly to help build our case against my parents. He had been their inside man all along. Marcus explained that Daniel had been recruited by my parents months before I ever discovered the fraud. They had convinced him that I was the real criminal, that I was planning to frame the entire family for crimes I had committed. They had played on his insecurities and his long-standing jealousy of my position in the family business. "Daniel has been documenting everything we said, everything we planned, every piece of evidence we gathered. Your parents have been 3 steps ahead of us this entire time because they knew exactly what we were doing." The scope of Daniel's betrayal was staggering. He had not just stolen our evidence, he had been actively sabotaging our investigation from the inside. Documents that we thought were secure had been altered. Witnesses we thought were protected had been intimidated. Legal strategies we thought were confidential had been countered before we could implement them. But the worst part was the personal betrayal. I had opened my heart to Daniel, sharing my pain and my fears about what our family had become. I had trusted him with my deepest emotions, and he had used that trust to manipulate me on behalf of the very people who had tried to destroy my life. The FBI agent, Rebecca Martinez, was furious when she learned about the security breach. "This is a disaster," she told our remaining coalition members. Daniel had access to witness statements, evidence logs, and strategic planning documents. We have to assume that everything we have done up to this point has been compromised. The legal implications were devastating. Our attorneys informed us that Daniel's betrayal could invalidate much of our evidence in court. Defense lawyers would argue that the investigation had been tainted by insider manipulation and that the evidence could not be trusted. My parents, meanwhile, went on the offensive. Using the information Daniel had provided, they filed a counter-lawsuit accusing me of orchestrating an elaborate fraud scheme to frame them for my own crimes. They claimed that I had manipulated Uncle James into making false statements, and that I had conspired with Marcus to fabricate evidence. The media, which had initially been sympathetic to our cause, began questioning our credibility. Headlines like "Family Feud turns ugly, who is really the criminal?" began appearing in local newspapers. My parents gave interviews portraying themselves as the real victims of a vindictive daughter who was willing to destroy her own family for money. The most crushing moment came when I received a recorded message from Daniel explaining his betrayal. "Serafina, you always thought you were smarter than everyone else. You always got the praise, the opportunities, the respect. But you were never as clever as you believed. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia showed me exactly who you really are, a manipulative criminal who was willing to frame her own family to cover up her crimes." The message revealed the depth of the family dysfunction that had made this situation possible. Daniel had been harboring resentment against me for years, feeling overlooked and undervalued compared to his successful cousin. My parents had expertly exploited those feelings to turn him into their weapon against me. For 3 days, it seemed like everything was lost. The FBI investigation stalled as they tried to determine which evidence was reliable and which had been compromised. Our attorneys warned us that the criminal case against my parents might collapse entirely due to Daniel's sabotage. I felt completely alone and defeated. The coalition that had given me strength was falling apart. Uncle James was terrified that Daniel's betrayal had exposed him to criminal charges. Mrs. Warren and the Pembertons were reconsidering their involvement in what now looked like a messy family dispute rather than a clear case of fraud. The lowest point came when I overheard 2 FBI agents discussing whether I might actually be the real criminal. "The evidence against her signature forgeries is pretty thin," one said. "What if the family is right and she has been playing us from the beginning?" That night, sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by legal documents and evidence that might no longer matter, I seriously considered giving up. My family had outmaneuvered me at every turn, using my own emotions and trust against me. Daniel's betrayal had not just damaged our legal case, it had shattered my faith in my ability to judge people's character. But as I sat there in the darkness, something inside me refused to surrender. I thought about all the victims who were counting on justice. I thought about Mrs. Warren's husband's memorial fund that had been stolen. I thought about the dozens of families whose charitable donations had been diverted to fund my parents' lavish lifestyle. Most importantly, I thought about the person I had become through this ordeal. I was no longer the naive woman who had trusted her family blindly. I was someone who understood that justice sometimes requires fighting against impossible odds, even when everyone you trust betrays you. Daniel's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed something crucial. My parents were not criminal masterminds. They were desperate people making increasingly reckless decisions. Their recruitment of Daniel showed that they were panicking, not planning strategically. If they were truly confident in their position, they would not need to rely on inside sabotage and media manipulation. They would not need to turn family members against each other. Their actions revealed weakness, not strength. As I prepared for what felt like the final phase of this battle, I realized that Daniel's betrayal might have actually given me valuable information. I now knew exactly how my parents operated, how they manipulated people, and what their weaknesses were. The war was not over. It was just entering its most dangerous phase. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source imaginable. It was Thursday morning when I received a call from someone I had never heard of before. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a computer forensics expert who had been hired by the Pemberton family to conduct an independent analysis of the financial records. "Miss Blackwell, I need to meet with you immediately. I have discovered something that will completely change this case, but I can only discuss it in person with proper legal representation present." Dr. Hendricks met us at our attorney's office with a laptop and several external hard drives. What she revealed in the next 2 hours would completely vindicate everything we had claimed and expose the true extent of my parents' criminal enterprise. "When I began analyzing the digital evidence," she explained, "I noticed some irregularities that suggested the presence of sophisticated malware designed to cover tracks and manipulate records. Your parents are not just embezzlers. They have been using advanced computer fraud techniques that require professional criminal expertise." The malware discovery led to a complete forensic reconstruction of every computer system that had been used in the fraud. What Dr. Hendricks found was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. My parents had been working with a professional cybercriminal organization that specialized in financial fraud targeting family businesses and charitable organizations. The signature forgeries that framed you and Daniel were not done manually, she continued. They were created using artificial intelligence software that can perfectly replicate handwriting patterns from digital samples. This is military-grade identity theft technology. But the most damaging discovery was a complete backup of all communications between my parents and their criminal associates. The backup had been automatically created by the malware as a security measure, and my parents had no idea it existed. These communications revealed that the fraud operation was much larger than anyone had suspected. My parents were part of a criminal network that had targeted over 50 wealthy families across the country, stealing an estimated $42 million over the past 5 years. The communications also revealed the true scope of Daniel's betrayal and recruitment. My parents had not just convinced him that I was the real criminal. They had actually been grooming him for over 2 years to be their successor in the criminal organization. He was not just a traitor, he was a criminal apprentice. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Dr. Hendricks had also discovered communications proving that my parents had been planning to eliminate me entirely once the fraud was discovered. Not just frame me for the crimes, but actually arrange for my death to look like a suicide caused by guilt over the embezzlement. This message from your father to his criminal contact is particularly chilling, Dr. Hendricks said, reading from her laptop. Richard writes, "The Serafina problem needs a permanent solution. Make it look like guilt and shame drove her over the edge. We cannot risk her intelligence interfering with our long-term plans." The room fell completely silent as the implications sank in. This was not just financial fraud or family betrayal. This was conspiracy to commit murder. My parents had been willing to kill their own daughter to protect their criminal enterprise. FBI agent Martinez, who had been skeptical of our case since Daniel's betrayal, was now fully convinced. "This changes everything," she said grimly. "We are no longer dealing with a family dispute or even simple embezzlement. This is organized crime at the highest level." The new evidence also completely exonerated Daniel, revealing that he had been manipulated far more extensively than anyone had realized. The communications showed that my parents had been using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, including drugs, slipped into his food to make him more susceptible to their influence. Daniel was not a willing traitor, Dr. Hendricks explained. He was a victim of systematic psychological abuse and chemical manipulation. The criminal organization your parents work with specializes in turning family members against each other to prevent organized resistance. This revelation led to an immediate search for Daniel, who was found 3 days later in a psychiatric facility in another state, suffering from severe psychological trauma and drug withdrawal symptoms. When he recovered enough to speak coherently, he had no memory of the past month and was horrified to learn what he had been manipulated into doing. The psychological manipulation explained so much about how my parents had been able to control our family for years. They had not just been stealing money, they had been systematically destroying the mental health and family bonds of anyone who might threaten their operation. But Dr. Hendricks had one more bombshell to deliver. Her forensic analysis had revealed that my parents were planning to flee the country within the next 72 hours using false identities provided by their criminal associates. They had already transferred most of their stolen money to offshore accounts and purchased airline tickets to a non-extradition country. "If we do not move immediately," Agent Martinez warned, "they will disappear forever, and none of their victims will ever see justice or recover their stolen money." The discovery triggered the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in our region's history. Federal agents simultaneously raided my parents' home, their business offices, and 3 additional locations where evidence was being stored. The operation also targeted other members of the criminal organization in 4 different states. The most satisfying moment came when I watched the news coverage of my parents being arrested at the airport just hours before their scheduled flight to Switzerland. They were both handcuffed and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, organized racketeering, computer fraud, money laundering, and dozens of other federal crimes. The evidence Dr. Hendricks had discovered was so overwhelming that my parents' attorneys immediately began discussing plea bargains rather than going to trial. The recorded communications about planning my murder had eliminated any possibility of sympathy from a jury. But perhaps the most important outcome was the recovery of the stolen money. Dr. Hendricks' forensic work had traced every dollar through the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Victims would eventually recover 93% of their stolen funds, an almost unprecedented recovery rate for this type of crime. As I stood outside the courthouse watching my parents being led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also profound sadness at the complete destruction of my family relationships. Uncle James, now cleared of any wrongdoing and freed from years of blackmail and intimidation, put his arm around my shoulders. "You saved all of us, Serafina. If you had not been brave enough to expose the truth, they would have eventually destroyed every member of this family." Dr. Hendricks had not just provided evidence, she had become an ally and eventually a close friend. Her expertise and dedication had made justice possible when everything seemed lost. She represented the kind of person I wanted in my life, going forward, someone committed to truth and justice rather than personal gain. The case that had started with a dinner seat had become a federal investigation that exposed a criminal organization and saved dozens of families from financial ruin. But more importantly, it had shown me who I really was and what I was capable of achieving when I refused to accept injustice. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where my parents had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Today was different, though. Today was the day we celebrated not just the end of their criminal enterprise, but the beginning of something beautiful that had grown from the ashes of their betrayal. The criminal organization my parents had been part of was completely dismantled. 14 people were convicted on federal charges, and over $60 million in stolen assets were recovered and returned to victims. The FBI called it one of the most successful financial crime investigations in the agency's history. Daniel, fully recovered from the psychological manipulation he had endured, had become one of my closest allies in rebuilding our shattered family relationships. "I will never forgive myself for what they made me do to you," he said during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "But I am grateful every day that you were strong enough to save all of us." The foundation that my parents had looted was reestablished under new leadership, with Marcus Webb serving as the chief financial officer and me as the executive director. We implemented transparency measures that would make future fraud impossible, and we redirected our charitable work toward helping other families who had been victimized by financial crimes. Mrs. Elizabeth Warren, the elderly widow whose husband's memorial fund had been stolen, became like a grandmother to me. She often said that watching me fight for justice had restored her faith in young people and family values. "Your parents failed to destroy the good person they raised," she told me. "That might be their greatest failure of all." Dr. Sarah Hendricks and I developed a friendship that eventually became something deeper. Her dedication to truth and justice aligned perfectly with the values I had discovered within myself during this ordeal. We were planning a small wedding for the following spring, centered around the chosen family we had built together. The Pemberton family offered me a position managing their family investments, recognizing that my experience with fraud prevention made me uniquely qualified to protect their assets. The salary was 3 times what I had earned working for my parents, but more importantly, they treated me with the respect and trust that my biological family had never shown. Uncle James, free from years of blackmail and intimidation, had started a support group for families affected by financial fraud. What happened to us was not just about money, he often said. It was about how criminals use our love for family against us. We have to help people understand that real family loyalty means protecting each other from harm, not covering up crimes. The most unexpected positive outcome was my relationship with Delilah. Prison had given her time to understand how thoroughly our parents had manipulated her. When she called me from federal prison 6 months into her sentence, she was a completely different person. "Serafina, I know I can never undo what I did to you," she said through tears. "But I want you to know that I finally understand what real family means. It means protecting the people you love, not using them. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of your forgiveness." Delilah's sentence was much lighter than our parents' because she cooperated fully with the investigation and because the evidence showed she had been groomed and manipulated from a young age. She would be eligible for parole in 3 years, and we were already discussing how she might contribute to the support work we were doing for other fraud victims. The dinner that had started this entire journey seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. The woman who had quietly accepted being displaced from her seat was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength comes from standing up for justice, even when it costs you everything you thought you valued. Looking around the courthouse celebration that day, surrounded by the people who had become my chosen family, I realized that my parents' greatest crime was not the money they stole. It was their failure to understand that real family is built on love, respect, and shared values, not blood relationships and blind loyalty. Marcus raised a toast to our group, to the family we chose, and the justice we fought for together. May we always remember that the strongest bonds are forged in the fire of shared struggle for what is right. As I looked around at these incredible people who had stood with me through the darkest period of my life, I felt a peace I had never experienced before. This was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, loyal, honest, and committed to protecting each other's well-being. The financial restitution had been important for the victims, but the emotional healing had been priceless for all of us. We had learned that justice is not just about punishment, it is about restoration and growth. We had all become better people through this experience. Dr. Hendricks squeezed my hand as we prepared to leave the courthouse. "Are you ready to go home?" she asked. Home. 6 months ago, that word had meant the house where I grew up, surrounded by people who shared my DNA, but not my values. Today, it meant the life I had built with people who had chosen to love and support me through the worst and best times of my life. "Yes," I said, looking around at my chosen family one more time. "I am ready to go home." The woman who had been betrayed by her biological family had found something infinitely more valuable: a family built on choice, respect, and shared commitment to justice. Sometimes, the most devastating betrayals lead to the most beautiful discoveries about who we really are and what we truly deserve. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized that the people you thought were your family were actually working against your best interests? How did you find the strength to stand up for justice when everyone around you was trying to silence you? I would love to hear your stories about family loyalty versus doing what is right in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding your true chosen family. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice. Remember that sometimes losing your biological family leads to finding your real family. May you always have the courage to choose justice over comfort and truth over convenience.